Textual criticism is something like vacuuming or cutting the grass. It's work that has to be done, and not many people enjoy doing it. Some people love it, though. It's programmatic work. It's sorting work. And this kind of work begins by looking at the apparatus in the Greek New Testament that you have. We're going to talk about how to do textual criticism beginning with the apparatus in both the United Bible Society Greek New Testament and the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament. So this lecture simply takes you through the process of learning how to read what look like footnotes at the bottom of your Greek New Testament page. We're going to be expanding on the method of textual criticism beyond this particular slide lecture. But here we're going to focus on sorting out the different readings in the manuscript through paying attention to the apparatus. This slide shows you where we're headed in future lectures. Once we sort out what the actual manuscript evidence is, as it's recorded in the apparatus of the Greek New Testament, then we have to go on to evaluate that evidence. So we move on to evaluating the external evidence in several ways by looking at the date of the manuscripts, the geographical distribution of the manuscripts, and then considering something that's called text types or groupings of manuscripts into different copying traditions and characteristics, and evaluating that evidence. Then we move on to something called internal evidence, where we're not looking at the manuscripts themselves, as I've just mentioned, but now considering scribal habits and the author's habits, and so trying to figure out what the probable original reading was of a particular New Testament text by looking at both the external and the internal evidence. Regarding this lecture, the sorting of different readings in manuscripts, we need to be able to read the apparatus. And it's going to be quite a bit easier to read the apparatus in the UBS edition compared to the Nestle-Aland edition. Now, the latest edition of Nestle-Aland is available, but if you don't have that edition, you can simply copy the relevant page from the Nestle-Aland 28th edition from probably any theological library that should have this Greek New Testament. You don't need to buy a new Nestle-Aland for this process or any future work that you'll do in textual criticism unless you want to. But you do need to be aware that there are some introductions in both of these critical editions of the Greek New Testament. These introductions give information about how to read the apparatus and understand the footnoting process and what's in margins and so forth. So any questions you have about what's going on in the apparatus are questions that the introductions will discuss, and you just have to take the time to read it. However, it does take time to become familiar with the different shorthand representations of interpreting the manuscript evidence that you find in the apparatus. And you'll become familiar with that much more quickly with the UBS edition, but the Nestle-Aland one is probably something that you need to keep referring to a table to remember what all their different signs and symbols are. Those signs and symbols are called sigla, or in the singular siglum, and you'll see some examples of that shortly. Now, to take you through the process of textual criticism, we're going to focus on a particular passage, and that is 1 John 5, verses 7 and 8. The discrepancy in manuscripts has to do with the addition or omission of a number of words in these verses. And those words are a Trinitarian statement in the text. You can find it in the King James Version, and I'll show you that on the next slide. The King James 1611 version of 1 John 5, 7, and 8 has some additional words in verse 7 that you won't find in most modern translations. It reads this way, "For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one." You can see the Trinitarian statement in that verse. Verse 8 goes on, "And there are three that bear witness in earth, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood, and these three agree in one." You can imagine why Orthodox Christianity would like to continue with what we just read and not find fault with what is in verse 7 here. It's a great passage to go to prove the Trinity. Now, as I said in the introduction to textual criticism, there is nothing that's going to change your theology when there are discrepancies in the manuscript evidence. So even if we don't have verse 7, we can still talk about the Trinity with many other texts in the New Testament. The New King James Version, which I mentioned in the introduction as a version that just tries to clean up the English somewhat of the 1611 King James Version, not surprisingly, reads essentially the same. You can see in verse 7 that once again it has the Trinitarian formula, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. Although the New King James Version claims to have a look at textual criticism in a fresh new way, it essentially affirms what we had back in 1611, and so ignores hundreds of years of development in the science of textual criticism. Now here you can see three other translations, the ESV, the NIV, and the NRSV. Notice how short verse 7 is. The Trinitarian formula is no longer present, for there are three that testify, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood, and these three agree, reads the ESV, and similarly the NIV and NRSV. Now let's have a look at Greek texts behind these translations. What I want to do is show you, first of all, that the Greek Orthodox Church today has the longer reading. You can see it just by looking at how many more words are in verse 7 than the previous slide, but you can also look at the Greek and see that it's saying, "For three are there, the ones bearing witness in the heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these, the three, one are," to give you a nice, smooth translation. And now, verse 8 is not a problem, so we won't continue with that. What I want to emphasize, though, is that in the Orthodox circles, the longer reading is present. Now, Nestle Aland 27th edition and the 28th edition too, but I'm presenting this lecture from the 27th edition, and the UBS 4th edition both have the shorter reading. Well, we'll return to the issue of what's going on here with the shorter and longer reading of this verse 7 of 1 John chapter 5. In this lecture, though, we just want to be able to figure out the evidence in the apparatus. And so at this part now, we're going to look at the United Bible Society critical edition of the New Testament. It looks something like this in this picture. You can see, even though it's small, here you can see that the top part is the reading of the text that has been reconstructed based on manuscript evidence. That's what you've been translating in your Greek course today. Then there's this line across the page and a smaller print discussion, which is what the apparatus is. That is all the discussion of what the different readings by different manuscripts are. Now, we have, as you might remember, over 5,000 different kinds of evidence overall for the New Testament. So you can see that the apparatus doesn't include all the information. Otherwise, it would be an incredibly long book. This then is just the more significant evidence that is going to make a difference in doing textual criticism. Now, at the very bottom of the page in the UBS edition here, there are some references to other parts of the New Testament, just as you might find in an English translation that wants to give references to compare in other parts of the New Testament, but that is not contributing to the discussion of textual criticism. On this slide, we're looking first of all at the Greek text itself to see that in verse 8 there is a number 4 next to the word blood, tohaima. And this number 4 refers you then to a number 4 in the apparatus. And that can be seen lower down where we have in another white box the note 4 and then 7 through 8, that's verses 7 through 8. And then something in parentheses it follows. It will be either an A, a B, a C, or a D in the UBS text. And A, in this case, means that the reading that the scholars have given is a reading that they think is certain. They don't have any doubt. So, looking at what's going on in verses 7 and 8, you can see that we have the shorter reading in verse 7 for this sentence. So that's what we have with the UBS text, and we can now look at the apparatus. On this slide, we have the full evidence in the apparatus for the reading in the UBS edition for verses 7 and 8 in 1 John. The previous slide had the first bit of information, the footnote 4, the verses 7 to 8, and then the certainty reading in parentheses of an A. Right after that, what follows is the preferred reading for the UBS text. Now look down toward the middle and bottom of this apparatus selection, and you'll see two parallel slanted lines. I've written there alternative reading after, and then those two lines. So everything up until those lines is the first reading, and it's the preferred reading. What comes after that will be a second reading, and third and fourth, however many there are for a particular textual problem. Not everything is present here for the second reading, but you can see that it says martyruntes en to urano ho pater. So it's going to give that Trinitarian reading in the next part. What we have then is the first and preferred reading here, and what I want to go through is how the UBS just presents the data. So after the certainty reading of an A in parentheses, we have a restatement of the reading that is up in the text, because this is the preferred reading. Martyruntes, and then verse 8, to pneuma, kai to hodor, kai to haima. Now after the reading comes the evidence. And what I've done is I've underlined the evidence and separated it one group of evidence from another using colors. So between the first two small purple lines are uncials or majuscules, two different words that mean the same thing. And what it means is that these manuscripts were written with capital letters. What that tells us is that they were written before the 9th century, because after the 9th century, the handwriting changed to minuscules. And the minuscules are represented here in the light blue reading, whereas the majuscules or uncials are represented with the red line underneath them. Now let's look at that red line and the information in it. There are actually three different ways to represent these uncial readings. One way is using the Hebrew alphabet, and in actual fact only one letter of the Hebrew alphabet was used. That's the first letter here. It's Aleph. If you know Hebrew, you can recognize that. Otherwise, it's a funny little squiggle with that moves diagonally from left down to the right, and then a little mark on each side of that line. Well, that's an Aleph. That's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Then scholars quickly turned to using the capital Greek letters, and we get that in the next bit of evidence. You get Aleph, Beth, Kappa, and Rho. Remember, capital Rho looks like a P to us in English. Then in parentheses we have a psi, but a different reading. Instead of marturuntes at the end of verse 7, psi reads marturusin. Now that's a slight change from the participle to the indicative. It's basically the same word. More importantly, this psi does not have the Trinitarian statement in verse 7. And so even though it's a different reading from these other bits of manuscript evidence, it still attests to the fact that there is no Trinitarian version of verse 7 for psi. So it is listed with the rest of the evidence, but in parentheses for the slight change from the participle to the indicative. After the parenthesis come some numbers that begin with a 0. 048, 049, 056, 0142. These are also ways to designate uncials. In fact, the capital letters way of designating uncials also has an option of 01, 02, and so forth. So all of these are the same. They're just different ways of designating the information. And the reason for the differences is simply that scholarship was developing and they needed more. They realized they needed more numbers than the alphabet numbers themselves. They needed to move into actual digits. What's important to note is that numbers that begin with a 0 are uncials. Numbers that don't begin with a 0 are minuscules. And so as you move to the other side, the right side of that purple line, we now have 33, 81, 88, and so forth, with the blue line underneath them, all the way up to 2,495. These are all minuscule manuscripts. With number 88, you see TXT, and you will from time to time get some sort of little abbreviation in association with a manuscript. You have to go to the introduction to perhaps a chart or some representation of what these abbreviations mean. There are just too many of them to go through them one by one in a lecture. So that's where you're going to have to be using your introduction. So find out what 88 TXT text means. Now after this next purple line, you have in italics BYZ. That stands for Byzantine or Byzantine manuscripts. In other words, not a list of individual manuscripts as we've had up until this point, but now just the basic statement that Byzantine manuscripts tend to have this reading. After that, on the next line in between the two purple lines, underlined in yellow or gold, we have lect and then an L with a number 598 and then an M. This evidence is lectionary evidence, where biblical texts were quoted in the lectionaries, and so the lectionary is also giving evidence for what kind of biblical text people had. So the capital L, lect, just says lectionaries have this reading, and a specific lectionary reading that's given here is lectionary number 598. And then you can look up what the M means there. After that, with the light green underline, comes the evidence from different versions. These would be early translations from the Greek. IT, you'd find from the introduction, stands for Old Latin manuscripts. Those are manuscripts that were in Latin prior to the Vulgate that Jerome translated, and so prior to the 5th century. And then specific further evidence is given with these versions. So this is Old Latin, and then you look up what AR means. Vulgate, you look up what WW means. SYR is Syriac manuscripts, P and H. Then Coptic, that's from Egypt. Both the Sahidic and the Baharic are represented there with the SA and the BO. Again, you'd find out that particular information from the introduction. Armenian versions, Ethiopic versions, Arabic versions, and Slavic versions have this evidence. Lots of early translations follow the shorter reading of 1 John 5:7. After the version evidence is listed, then you move to church fathers, beginning with Irenaeus. And there's quite a bit of evidence here in this UBS text, all the way through Cyril, right at the bottom, that's given. And then we have the parallel lines, which means you're moving to the next reading. When you do textual criticism, you will have to sort out what the readings are and what the external evidence is, and then you're going to have to evaluate that external evidence in terms of whether it's strong or weak. And so at this point, looking at the apparatus, all you're doing is discovering what the readings are and discovering what the evidence is. So then you'd move on to the next reading, which includes the Trinitarian statement, and do the same thing. The Nestle-Aland critical edition of the New Testament looks like this. You're familiar with this. You have the critically established Greek text that you'd be translating that stands out most because it's in larger print and begins with the word N and goes all the way through, on this page, the first 4 verses of 1 John 5:8. To pneuma, kai to, and then on to the next page. In the right margin are texts parallel to what you find in 1 John, according to those who've created this edition. That can be helpful if you're trying to find out other passages that are somehow similar to your passage. What's especially important is if something is in italics, because then they think that that is possibly a quotation of a few words or even more. However, what we're talking about here now is what's at the bottom of the page, and that is now the apparatus for the Nestle-Aland edition. Notice that the very first number there is 19, so that is going to refer to verse 19 up at the very top of the page. And then right after that is something that looks like a T, which is a symbol, and you'll see that that T appears right at the top of the page, as well as in the apparatus, right after the word hemes. And so it's these symbols that the Nestle-Aland critical edition uses that make it more difficult to figure out what's going on in this critical edition. The reason why it's more difficult is simply that there are so many more symbols that they use. So you really have to use the introduction for the Nestle-Aland edition to figure out what those symbols mean. Now let's move on and have a closer look at this. So there again we have the critically restored text, we have the apparatus showing alternative readings and evidence, and we have scripture parallels and quotations in italics. The apparatus now in closer detail. So you see in the second paragraph here, it starts with 5,1, a very European way of distinguishing chapter and verse instead of the colon or the period. Then as you scan through this, just look carefully at it now for a bit. In fact, look at the same line where you have 5,1, and you'll see right about in the middle of the line a dotted line that is vertical. There is a separation of different manuscript evidence. That's your break between different readings. And then you have a little bit further down, you have another one of those vertical lines. Down the same line, you have another one of those vertical lines that's broken with TXT in italics. The TXT here means the text as they have represented it in the critically established Greek text above the apparatus. So quite differently from the UBS text, the preferred reading comes last rather than first in the Nestle-Aland version. And then you move on right at the end of that line to another textual problem. On this slide, the white background box is the apparatus in the Nestle-Aland critical edition of the New Testament. And our particular verse is indicated with an open circle at the end of a golden arrow that I've drawn onto the apparatus. Right after that open circle is 7/8, which is verses 7 and 8 of chapter 5. Now, as you look at this for a bit, you can quickly see that there are a lot more signs, symbols, and abbreviations that are used. The Nestle-Aland edition is coming from Europe, and various languages are being avoided by using these signs, symbols, and abbreviations, so that people who speak German or English can read the same apparatus and understand it the same way. When words do need to be used, they use Latin, just like several hundred years ago, people used to use Latin to communicate across the different languages of different countries. So this is why the Nestle-Aland apparatus is a bit more difficult to follow. To get at the signs, symbols, and abbreviations, you can consult the introduction as well as the appendix of the Nestle-Aland critical edition. And you do need to spend some time looking at both the front and the back of your Nestle-Aland New Testament to get an idea of where things are, so that when you do textual criticism, you can find those abbreviations. If you ever have some Latin that you need to look up, remember that there are different searches that on Google that would let you translate another language. You can translate from German to English or English to German, but you can also do that with Latin and other languages. All you do is copy the text and then say what you're translating from and what you want to translate to. And so look up Google Translator, for example, and you can start to do that sort of thing. Hopefully there's not too much of that you would have to get involved in, and you don't have to worry too much about that, except this verse does have some Latin in it. I'll point that out as we go through. The Nestle-Aland information for verses 7 and 8 begins with readings that are rejected by the committee putting this critical edition together. Again, they're separated. The different readings are separated with a vertical broken line. Now look at the very last line in the white box. I've put a thick red line underneath it. This is the last reading. You can see the vertical broken line, and then in italics you see TXT, which is text. They always put that in there to tell you, and this is the reading that we put in the text of our critical edition. And then comes the evidence. Now, the evidence is presented in the same kind of order as in the UBS text. However, what you're met with in this particular example is some Latin and even an abbreviation. I know you're not thrilled to know this, but CODD is codices. These are basically manuscripts of Greek. And so in addition to that, then you have the Vulgate, the Sahidic is in parentheses, Bohairic and Syriac. These are different translations, early translations. And then a comma, a semicolon, then Tertullian, question mark. They think Tertullian had this reading. Then CL, that would be Clement, then OR would be Origen, and etc. They've given you some church father evidence, but not all of it. And that's all the evidence they're giving you. The reason it's so weak in this case is that the vast majority of evidence from the early church is not to have the long reading in it. Now, go back to the beginning of the verses 7 and 8. Note. After you have that symbol, then at the very far right of that line that says add the following, then you have the Greek, en to urano ho pater hologos kai to hagion pneuma kai hutoi hoi tres hen esin. And then verse 8, and so we have kai tres esin hoi marturuntes en te ge to, and then suddenly we have pi nu and then a period and then kappa and a period. What they're doing is they're abbreviating the text. The reason they're abbreviating this is because you actually know what those words are. How do you know? They're in the text above. So PN, or pi nu, period, stands for spirit, and then the kappa period would be chi, and so forth. All you have to do is check above to see what those words really are. So all of that, several lines, is what the first reading is. Now the evidence for that follows, and they say a minuscule number 221, and you can look up what VL is. Then 2318 is given. So those are two minuscules. Then they move immediately to the translations, VG for Vulgate. Now we have a parenthesis with a couple minuscules, 61 and 629, And then it says which was actually omit, and it's a few words should be omitted here. And then they give you some other evidence, and then other a few other ones, all in that parentheses. So, although again it's in parentheses, it's still evidence for the addition of the Trinitarian statement. So this is their first textual witness, their first textual reading, and all the witnesses that follow. Then it's another broken line, and now we have Latin in terra. This is what you could put into a Google Translator if you wanted to, but you can almost see it. Perhaps if you know Spanish, or even just because of the English, in terra, in the earth, spiritus, spirit, et aqua, water, et sanguis, blood, and then it's got another parenthetical change with different pieces of evidence from the Vulgate. And then it continues with several different readings it put in parentheses, but all suggesting there that you have some kind of the addition of the Trinitarian formula. So we have three readings represented here by the Nestle-Aland version, and again the text that they have chosen is what's listed last. It's not smooth sailing the first time you go through it, but by flipping back and forth to look at up the symbols and just writing out the information, perhaps putting it in a table with the different readings, you can then start to work with the evidence that they cite. This is the external evidence, the manuscript reading. With this and the next two slides, I've given you some of the symbols or abbreviations that have been used by Nestle-Aland. And I've take, for example, the second row. AL is an abbreviation for the Latin alii, and then I've given you the translation of that, others. So that would be referring to and other manuscripts if you see AL. PM would be per multi, and that would mean a great many other manuscripts, and so forth. Have a look at this. Know that you can come back to this, but really all this is what you'll find in Nestle-Aland, although unfortunately they're not going to be translating the Latin. So this can be helpful for you. And here is another part of the information you would need to use the Nestle-Aland Critical Edition. And finally, here is the end of the table. So, reading the apparatus. The apparatus lists evidence for different readings in the following order. Papyri, which we haven't seen an example yet of. I'll say a word about that in a moment. Uncials, also called majuscules, the capital letter manuscripts up till the 9th century. Minuscules, the cursive kind of handwriting with lowercase letters beginning in the 9th century. Lectionaries, versions, those are translations, and then the Church Fathers. So we'll continue this lecture with the next group of slides, but let me conclude by saying just a quick word about the papyri. If there is evidence from a papyrus, that would be represented in either UBS or Nestle-Aland with a P, and then a superscript to tell you which number papyrus has that evidence. P57, for example, is a papyrus that is simply numbered 57, and that would appear before the uncial evidence is given. Any papyrus evidence is early. It might be about the same time as an unseal, an early unseal, but it's really strong early evidence. So that then concludes this second part of the lecture on textual criticism.